Right now, we're dealing with a sense of loss as a society, as a people. Ever since the pandemic came, people have lost a way of life. They've lost a whole world. So that sense of loss and dealing with that is something that is common to all of us today. But the loss that you feel when you lose a son is not just that of loss, but of guilt.
Hi, I'm Shoma Chaudhury. Thanks for watching Enquiry. The blueprint of every life is different, but sometimes listening to the lives of others gives us insight into our own or provides inspiration about how to ride success and adversity. My guest this week has lived a kaleidoscopic life. He experienced dizzying success in Italy and Europe, some success in Hollywood, Bollywood, and on stage. He had a series of relationships with gifted and temperamental women, experimented with an open marriage, and lost a beloved son to suicide. He also had extraordinary parents who fought for independence and then became spiritual leaders in different traditions. His mother, a Buddhist nun, and his father, a psychic healer. Most crucially, he was a caregiver to two people suffering from mental health issues at a time when all of this was very taboo. So, how did he keep his wheel steady through all of this? I'll be speaking to actor Kabir Bedi about all of this and more on Enquiry today. Thank you very much for joining me on the show, Kabir. I've been wanting you on the show for a long time, so it's a real pleasure to have you.
Thank you, Shoma. I've been watching your show and admiring what you do. And unfortunately, in the recent weeks when I've been promoting the book, I haven't been able to keep up with your recent episodes, but I certainly hope to catch up with it once things calm down a little more. But I do follow your show.
Thank you, Kabir. And I read your book, and it's just like 7 lifetimes packed into one life. It's really kaleidoscopic. There's glamour, there's victory, there's success, there's terrible, terrible tragedy. And I would like to explore all aspects of that. I just wanted to start very briefly with the fact that your career straddled, America, Europe, the giants of Bollywood, from Omar Sharif to Michael Caine to, Audrey Hepburn. So, but in that entire kaleidoscope of people that you met, if you were to pick just one or two that really, really sort of left an imprint in your mind, who would you pick?
You mentioned, Shoma, I met a lot of people in my life across Hollywood, Bollywood, Europe, 3 continents. A lot of remarkable people. But I must say the meeting that springs to mind as you ask me is my meeting with Fellini, when Parveen and I met him in Rome at the height of my success of Sandokan. And he invited me because he knew that this Indian actor had come and taken Italy by storm. My series was breaking all records. And he came with his wife, Giulietta Messina, who was his muse, who had also won many awards, the Cannes Film Award, and the Oscar for her performance in his film, The Nights of Cabiria. And to be feted and praised by Fellini was the height of praise for me, because as a student at St. Stephen's College, I had student lines at night to get tickets to his films. And to get praise from him was just extraordinary. And the way he praised me, and I said, well, I've been lucky. He said, luck, yes, but this kind of success. He says, but you're lucky to have her in your life, pointing to Parveen. And Parveen flashed a smile. And it was a wonderful conversation. I won't detail it here, but it's in my book. And it was a wonderful meeting. But I met some remarkable people along the way. Meeting the Dalai Lama and seeing his aura, meeting Pope John Paul II, holding his hand and feeling his incredible vibrations, meeting Jiddu Krishnamurti and getting my whole thought process challenged and reordered. So there's a lot of extraordinary people, but also some of the most extraordinary people I met are unknown people, because my parents' backgrounds, there were all kinds of people that served society, served little villages, little heroes in little towns that really moved me, but they're not names.
I found it fascinating that when you met Audrey Hepburn, she started to speak to you about Tagore, and then
Yes.
that's a shard of conversation I would have loved to know more about, but you got pulled away. So,
Yes. Well, Audrey Hepburn evidently was very fascinated with Tagore and asked me about it, and then I couldn't complete the conversation. But she asked me if I knew of Tagore, and I said, well, I didn't know him personally because he passed away, but I had spent a year of my life in Shantiniketan because my parents sent me there. So I had a good sense of what it was like to be in an institution created by Rabindranath Tagore, to rise in the morning and do Rabindra Sangeet and be taught under the trees with makeshift blackboards propped up, to sit on the ground and eat. And this was after taking me out of the Western style education of Delhi Public School and Sherwood College in Nainital, etc. We were used to a certain type of system of education. This showed me that education can be anything. In fact, it made me realize that there are different systems in life, and many people live in different systems. And it's not all one monotheistic way that life can be conducted, that life can be lived in many ways. And the example of my parents' life also showed me that life can be lived in very different ways, because they were very different people who lived very different lives.
So one big strand in your life, Kabir, has been spirituality and different streams of spirituality. It's fascinating. You said Krishnamurti shaped your thinking, at Shantiniketan. Well, that's not spiritual, but that's a different system of thinking. And then your mother was a Buddhist nun. Your father was a sort of spiritual mystic in a different way. You yourself have had experience in Israel and in the Guru Nanak,
Harbandar Sahib, Golden Temple, yes.
Yes. So, can you talk about your parents? I mean, what was their two different experiences of spirituality and how did they come to it?
So, with my parents, you have a case of two young idealistic people that come to India and from Oxford and fight for India's independence. And they knew Bose and they knew Nehru and they knew Gandhi. In fact, my mother was a hand-picked satyagrahi of Mahatma Gandhi. And they lived in huts while they fought for freedom in Lahore. And this was an interesting time because they were the leftists of the age. And in these huts that they set up, which the police always watched and harassed them, etc., were people that became very famous later. People like Gyani Zail Singh, who became president, and Inder Kumar Gujral, who became prime minister, Sheikh Abdullah, who became the ruler of Kashmir. These were all the lefties. Sheikh Khushwant Singh would come as a sympathizer, though not as an activist. B.C. Sanyal, the artist, Hafiz Jalandhari. So this was the kind of intellectual ferment of the freedom movement from which they moved after independence to becoming spiritual figures. And my father is a descendant of Guru Baba Nanak. He revered him, wrote books about him, but became an independent philosopher with a philosophy completely of his own, which was very new age in its thinking, consciousness. But I'd also joined my mother's journey and search for Buddhism because she discovered Buddhism. And I was part of that discovery. I went to Burma with her and actually got ordained as a Buddhist monk with my head shaved, wearing orange robes, going out to the black lacquer, begging bowl in the morning to get alms for the day. So that was part of my spiritual exploration.
So Kabir, I found it fascinating when I was reading your book that your mother went to Burma and, she had a spiritual experience there. She ended up being one of the most revered Buddhist nuns. But that spiritual awakening she had there led her to also have a nervous breakdown. So can you talk about that and why did she have that kind of response? And how did that then evolve into her becoming a nun?
When you have profound spiritual experiences that shake you to the core, the body has its own reaction because it is completely unfamiliar territory. And I think the nervous breakdown, as they call it, is a word for something that doctors just don't understand. It's called nervous breakdown. Somebody's system just broke down and collapsed. I think with the intensity of the experience that she had, which was like an enlightenment experience in terms of the way she describes it, about seeing the interconnectedness of everything, the oneness of everything. It felt as though the earth was lighted from within. It felt like her deepest core had been touched. All those terms give me the feeling of somebody having a moment of illumination. The same thing actually happened in a different way to my father as well, which I also saw. He was silent and communicating with something, and then he came back and he started almost channeling things through him, and then he was writing, automatic writing, then he started speaking in different ways, and his life and mind changed. So when people go through these experiences, things happen and the body responds. So and she recovered from that nervous breakdown, but it led to her becoming celibate. It led to her formally becoming a Buddhist. It led to her actually discovering Mahayana Buddhism when the Tibetans with the Dalai Lama came to India after the Dalai Lama had to flee Tibet in 1959. And through that experience of the refugee camps, discovering the wealth of knowledge and tradition that was in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, and absolutely going into that, discovering a guru, becoming a nun, and ultimately being made the highest Buddhist nun in the world, which was an extraordinary achievement for a woman. So she was always a seeker. And when you're seeking, when that moment of illumination comes, no one can say. As long as you're on that path, something opens up, something develops, and something larger happens. This is what I've seen, shared, and learned from myself, because it gave me a lifelong curiosity in terms of what is the truth of the matter. Sikhism on one side, Buddhism on the other side, Christianity from my schools, Hinduism in our ethos. All religions give us great human systems to live by, but philosophically they're saying different things.
So, you mentioned that your father also had a spiritual experience like your mother.
Yes. Yes.
But he had it in Nizamuddin. So was it at
That's
the Nizamuddin Aulia?
Yes, we were living quite close to the Dargah of Nizamuddin, Hazrat Nizamuddin Aulia, and he'd always had this kind of spiritual energy about him, and his whole life had a kind of idealistic fervor to it, where he just wanted good for others, which is why he became a communist, which is why he worked, after coming from Oxford, he could have got the best jobs in town, but he gave it all up for the freedom of the country, for the betterment of others. And the experience he had was also so strange that, doctors were called in and couldn't understand what was happening, because he was going through these states of just being in one place, focused on something. And then he would come and he would start talking in these strange ways. And all that passed. At the end, what emerged was a man who had a totally revolutionary philosophy of life, existence, of consciousness in every single thing around us, every leaf, every stone, every speck of dust in the earth, and how that affects us, and how our own conscience, which we call the eye of the soul, affects us and changes our lives in ways. And he also believed that blocked creativity creates disease. So his biggest effort in life was to make people become the best they could be. And I've seen him change lives. More than that, he had this great gift of healing. There was a case which is chronicled in a medical journal in Italy by Professor Maurizio Grandi, who was an expert on oncology, where a woman who had been given 5 months to live, even with chemotherapy, went on to live 40 years after he began his vibrational therapy on her. He believed in the power of vibrational therapy, of sound, light, music, colors, and the energies they give. And he had this energy in his hand that I would sense when I touched him, a kind of low hum almost. That was very effective. But then I said to myself, how do you heal people? He said, I don't heal people. how do they get healed? He said, I put them in touch with the root of their problem, the root cause of their problem. So I said, so how do you know what the root cause of the problem is? And he said, I know this because that is the gift I have. What people took years in therapy to divine, he seemed to pick up in the course of a single conversation. And he said, once I put people in touch with the root cause, their own consciousness knows what to do. Their own consciousness heals them. And together with his vibrational therapy and putting their consciousness in touch, he had some remarkable results. If you look at traditional Indian cosmology in terms of our traditional scriptures, it is the closest thing to modern scientific belief in the cosmos. There's no way they could have measured it in those days. They must have gone into meditative states and come in touch with parts of their consciousness which gave them these extraordinary insights that they were able to put down. That's the only way they could possibly have divined what is proving to be scientifically true today. So meditation has extraordinary potential in terms of being able to give you insights, change your lives, change your behavior, and change your reality. Because ultimately, your reality is changed by your beliefs, your expectations, and your actions. There's a center in Italy that continued his work even after he passed away, near Venice, in a city called Cittadella. And also the story is of the relationship between my father and mother, and how in a strange way, divided by beliefs, divided by continents, they remained soulmates to the end of their lives.
So, that was fascinating, Kabir, because you also eventually, despite having so many different diverse influences in your life, you've spoken about how you finally kind of have arrived at the discipline of Vipassana, which has helped you. You lived a very turbulent life yourself. Can you talk about, what solace you found in Vipassana, or what spiritual awakening you found through Vipassana?
Shoma, I discovered Vipassana when I went to Burma and with my mother and had myself ordained as a Buddhist monk for 3 months. And I was taught Vipassana by Mahasi Sayadaw, who was one of Burma's greatest living saint, as was my mother. He is the man who taught Goenkaji Vipassana, and Goenkaji in turn spread it all over India and raised the consciousness of so many people. Now, even though I had that training at a very young age, perhaps because I was so impressionable, it left a very deep impression on me. Because at that age, when your mind normally is running into different directions or thinking of things to play with, etc., I was sitting there realizing that I'm not in control of my mind. My mind just runs away with me. I don't tell my mind what to think about. It thinks about whatever it likes to think about, and then I follow it. And I become a slave of wherever it chooses to go. That awareness helped me tremendously in terms of focusing my mind on the need to think, I'm in charge. I decide what I think about. And focusing my mind on what I wanted to think about. And this helped me greatly in terms of achieving goals, in terms of focusing my life. But at some level, it didn't seem to train me fully to deal with the emotional aspects of my life that I face, because emotions do run away with you, especially when you're in turbulent relationships like I was. And that was one of the big challenges of my life. There's many things I've realized later in life, of choices I should have made in these relationships, perhaps walked out of them earlier, perhaps not entered some in certain cases, or whatever I did. But one learns as one goes along. And I learned from all my relationships. Because my need always was for love, for companionship. And it was not fulfilled in one way, even by having a very open relationship with Prathma. Then I moved on to a relationship that seemed to promise me fidelity. But that again came with its own problems of stardom and depression and other things, which again created other tensions in my life. All of this I experienced and I've shared with the greatest honesty that I could. And I could do this because I've been equally harsh to myself. I've not spared myself in terms of my feelings, in terms of my weaknesses, in terms of my faults. But by the same token, I'm free to call that out in others as well, remarkable as they were, wondrous as they were, and yet deeply traumatic too.
In fact, a very tragic strand in your life, Kabir, has been that, you were deeply in love with Parveen Babi, who had mental health issues and, probably schizophrenia, depression. And then you, of course, lost your son, Siddharth, to schizophrenia as well, and he committed suicide. So, having gone through that extremely painful relationship, and so many years later, there still isn't enough discussion around these issues or even awareness. Sushant Singh Rajput recently, when he committed suicide, it was almost like, people felt that to say that he may have been depressed or suffering from some mental health was almost an insult to him, So that's how low the discourse on this still is. So when you look back at the loss of your son, Kabir, what is the deepest, most difficult sort of, insights, learnings that you took from that, which maybe you could speak of, which will help others who may be going through that experience?
Shoma, it's very tragic when a son is affected by schizophrenia, and especially when that son is on the verge of a brilliant career in the internet world, a graduate of Carnegie Mellon University, and there's a son that you love. Now, I've chronicled that journey because it was a deeply felt story of a father and son going through this together. And I must say one thing at the beginning, because I don't want people to lose hope. Medicines today are far more effective than they were at that time. But at that time, I was dealing with a situation where not only the medicines didn't seem to be working, but he had a reluctance to take them. Because one of the biggest problems that carers face in such situations is that the afflicted person does not want to accept there is a problem. That is the biggest problem to overcome. Once you accept that, then the journey about getting them to deal with it. And what I also need to express is that the person who's suffering is not just the afflicted. The caregiver suffers as much because he is adjusting, he's compensating, he's trying to do the best for the person that he loves. But the person that he loved is not the person that he's looking at. Something fundamentally has changed. And you have to allow for that, even though you love them. And you must love them because at some unconscious level, they keep receiving it. People shouldn't give up hope. They must always try and give hope. And in the case of my son, whether it's the failure of medicines, whether it's the failure, or whether it was sheer brilliance where he didn't like the prognosis of what he saw because he researched everything on the internet. In the end, I lost him. And what that does to the psyche is something deeply wounding. Because you did your best, you tried to save his life, and his life well worth saving, and yet he chose to go. What are the consequences of that? That also I've talked about because it is as profoundly moving. Because, right now, we're dealing with a sense of loss. As a society, as a people, ever since the pandemic came, people have lost a way of life. People have lost jobs. People have lost loved ones. People have lost their offices. People have lost many things that were part of a familiar world. They've lost a whole world. So that sense of loss and dealing with that is something that is common to all of us today. But the loss that you feel when you lose a son is not just that of loss, but of guilt. Everyone who knows the person feels somehow they could have done something to say something, do something to save that person. And the fact is you did your best. But it takes a long time to accept that and to make peace with that. Because it's natural to blame yourself. I think caregivers should know that what's expected of them is to do the best they can. And above all, that people that know these families should not treat it with the stigma that they give it, like Sushant Singh Rajput problem. If he had a problem, it's a manageable problem. The medicines are there. Do not treat mental illnesses worse than you treat physical illnesses. It's an illness of the mind. It's healable, treatable, manageable, as is with the body. Maybe more complex in certain ways, but the stigma is totally unjustified. And that's one of the messages I wanted to share.
You know, Kabir, the other thing that you mention in the book actually is this, and you sort of spoke of it right now, is the reluctance for some who are suffering from mental illness to seek help, or even then to take medicines. And
Yes.
your son, who was extremely bright, felt that taking the medicines actually dulled his brain, made him almost not exist. Yeah. So the price of being well was also the price of not feeling alive anymore, being dead.
Yes. This was the big dilemma. This is the big dilemma, because when he took the medicines, he felt deadened. And the doctor said, if he doesn't take the medicine, there'll be psychotic outbreaks. And I'm the, not caregiver, but I'm also the enforcer. I have to make sure he takes the medicines. This creates a huge conflict. And when he doesn't take the medicines, he feels normal. So what do you do? And that is also what I've explored in terms of what do you do in situations like that? How do you deal with situations like that? It's not easy. It's very, very difficult, because what you're trying to do at the end of it is save a beautiful life. And that life is not cooperating with you. How do you deal with that? It's all laid out.
And you mentioned about the guilt, after losing him. Mm-hmm. I mean, we can't even begin to imagine the trauma of that. But just as a caregiver, Kabir, again, the fact that so many people are struggling with this, there aren't enough, even places like, where people can live independent with assisted lives. There's very little infrastructure around this. So this thing about caregiving, for those who might be listening, at some point, is there a kind of fatigue, a resentment? How did you cope with that? And now, are there other ways that caregivers can seek health for themselves? And at which point, how did you find the balance between giving care to him and keeping yourself sane and in whatever way healthy?
It's not an easy question to answer. There are more facilities today, etc. But like I said, you have to sympathize as much with the caregiver as with the afflicted. In the case of my son, for 3 years, we were wrestling with unknown ghosts. We didn't know what the problem was. And he was trying to find his treatment. We were putting him in touch with people. We were sending him to various places. He was choosing to go to various places because he was very bright. And things were going wrong, getting worse and worse. But then he had a psychotic attack in Montreal, where he freaked out in the streets. It took 8 policemen to pin him down and took him to the psychiatric ward of the hospital in Montreal. And that's when we actually learned that he had schizophrenia. So 3 years, we didn't know what was wrong. So dealing with that was my biggest priority. I didn't have time to get tired, because it all happened too suddenly between his coming back to LA and his decision to end his life. It was not even 4 months. So there was no fatigue on my side, but I can understand how people in long-term situations can get tired, because, we're all human. We're all human. There's so much you can give. And if there doesn't seem to be anything happening, people get tired. And I sympathize with that. And I can't get into, I'm not a doctor, so I won't enter into what can or cannot be done. All I can say is that there has to be a sense of commitment to the caring of people. And that should not be given up, because at an unconscious level, they do need you. They do sense you. I won't dwell on this more, because
Yeah.
I'm not an expert, but I can only talk about my own experience and what happens in those situations and what a tragedy it is. And yet, there is far more hope today than it was then. So in a sense, it doubles the tragedy of what happened then. It took a lot for me to go back into that because I'd come to terms with that. I'd come to peace with that. And I'd reopen all that emotional state to write about it. So it wasn't easy to write about it at all. But I hope that people reading it will get a sense of what it is like to be in those situations and what it takes to deal with that.
So thank you for sharing that, Kabir. And, I'm just going to dwell a little bit on the other relationship you had, which also had mental illness, which was Parveen Babi. And, she was clearly manifesting that quite early in the relationship, the mood swings, much of which you have described, the paranoia, the mood swings. But she left you and then went on to have a relationship with Mahesh Bhatt. There was talk of her having a relationship with other Bollywood stars. She ended in a very isolated, and tragic death herself. But in that relationship, Kabir, when you look back, was it similar? Was the pattern similar of her not wanting to accept and seek help? I asked this question that I asked Zinat once, that what makes people stay you're very successful, you can see something's going downhill. What makes you stay in that relationship? I think it would help others recognize patterns in their own life as well.
Yeah. Sure. I first want to clarify that my relationship with Parveen Babi was almost 20 years before Siddharth's passing. So Siddharth's passing happened in 97, and my relationship with Parveen was in the late 70s. It was very complicated to deal with that because that was my first experience of a person who had these imbalances. And, sometimes you just ascribe it to people having a bad day, having a mood, etc. Because there were so many wonderfully luminous things about her, the way she loved, the way she talked, the way she thought. And this relationship actually began in India before my European success, when Parveen was a bigger star than me, and continued. And I went to Italy with her at the time of Sandokan, when suddenly I became the biggest star in Europe. And her problems were manifesting at that time. So it created this strange dichotomy between the euphoria of my success and the sadness of what I was having to deal with her mental states. And it certainly was very difficult for me it was impossible for me to walk away from that because I saw myself as her protector, and she desperately needed protection. And she had a tremendous fear of doctors because those days the stigma against mental illness was so great that her biggest fear was that if the industry found out, they would drop her overnight and she'd lose everything. And she was a girl that came from a family that had seen good times, a family that once served the Emperor Humayun, but had fallen on bad times and didn't have much money. She is a girl that came to Bombay to buy a home and a car. It was a career in acting and became a star because she fell in love with her profession. Her biggest fear was that it would all go if people found out. And she was sure that even doctors would talk about it to their friends, their relatives, whoever, and the industry would find out because it's a small society at a certain level. So, A, not wanting to accept her condition. Secondly, not wanting to admit it even to herself and others because of the fear, really was the biggest block in having this treated. And I think my desire to have her treated was one of the primary reasons for our breakup in the end.
So through all this, the word you keep using is turbulence, and it really is that. I mean, it's staggering when one reads your life story, that the amount of turbulence that you really faced. You had bankruptcy, you had turbulent relationships, so much loss.
The bankruptcy was due to bad investments I made, even after all the money I made. But those things happened too, and how I rose from that is also part of my story.
Yeah, but in that, if you were to sort of distill all of it into some, now insight about yourself, what kept you steady through all of this, Kabir? What made you not go under?
A belief in the same self that drove me to an interview with the Beatles, the same self that came to Bombay with 700 rupees in his pocket, the same self that left advertising, the security of advertising to begin a Bollywood career, the same self that took a chance on a European career. There's a part of me that always believes in the best and believes the best is yet to come. And I always reinvent myself in certain ways, as I have, from being a journalist to being an ad man, to being an actor, to being an international actor, and now an author. I always reinvent myself. And I had that belief in me that I can reinvent myself, that I do have strengths within myself that made me before and can serve me again in the future. That keeps me going.
So, to end on a happy note was that your encounter with the Beatles, what did you take away from that?
It was euphoric, absolutely euphoric meeting the Beatles. They were my gods as musicians, but also they represented the whole 60s and what it was like to live in the 60s. A time of social change, a time of counterculture movements, a time of hippies, a time of flower power, miniskirts, psychedelia, everything. They represented that whole age to me, and I was part of that age. So there's no question what the Beatles represented to me, but what was important was what that interview meant to me. And that interview really became a turning point in my life. It was a turning point in my life, firstly, because of how I got the interview, secondly, because of what happened in the interview, but more, which is beautifully recounted, but what happened after the interview, when All India Radio erased the tapes because they didn't have money for other tapes after I'd done the interview, which led to my life-changing decision of leaving India. And how that interview changed my life, it makes it the opening chapter of my book.
So thank you so much, Kabir. You have this sort of maxim in your life that you can co-create it and, like you said, reinvent yourself all the time. So
right.
Coming from this extremely richly, very, sort of absolutely packed life that you've led, that's a great takeaway to take from it, that you really can create your own life. So thank you very much, Kabir.
Thank you, Shoma. Thank you for asking me to come. Thank you for reading my book. Thank you for appreciating it and helping me spread the word. I'm most grateful. And I look forward to seeing you again on your show on another day, another time.
Thanks, Kabir.